The Nuts and Bolts of Writing, Season 2, a podcast where we talk about literature, the ins and outs of writing, and how to actually start writing. Hey everyone, this is your girl Tete DePunk, one of the co-hosts of the Nuts and Bolts of Writing. Today I will be interviewing writer James Michels, author of novels such as The Ballad of Johnny Carlo, Ice Rising, and its sequel, Icebox. Prolific in the crime thriller genre, James Michels also recently released a crime fiction anthology, Life's Darkest Corners, which we will link in the description below to all of the books, as well as where you can follow James Michels on social media as well. As of 2015, he is an officer with the Department of Corrections. Crime fiction explores the darker realities of life, often exposing social and personal issues in ways that other genres may not fully show. Its focus on the grittiness of the ordinary reality for the individual facing an unfriendly world has made this particular genre a compelling one. Author James Michels has explored and mastered this genre with his own impressive work. We're thrilled to have James on our podcast today. Well, we're very thrilled to have you on today. Welcome to the Nuts and Bolts of Writing. And I just wanted to ask you, James, what had got you into writing in the first place? What inspired you? What sparked that literary interest?
Well, I've always been an avid reader, and you know how they say you can't just wake up and be such and such, or wake up and do such and such. Well, for me, I kind of did. I was at a time in my life where I wanted to kind of just develop myself more as a person. Learn some new things, accomplish new things, set new goals for myself, and one of them was, why don't I just write a book? And like I said, I've always been an avid reader, and I was really on a big reading kick at that time, which I still am on. And so I kind of wanted to like join this, like the world of writers, pretty much. So I found a decent premise in my head, and one day I just went to the computer and started typing chapter one. But what happened from there was, as I was writing the first book, which I would then publish and it would become Ice Rising, I realized halfway through the story that it was going to have to become a series because it was getting very long. And other ideas started planting themselves in my head about other stories that I can write. And I realized that what this turned into for me was, it was something I never knew I had about myself, which was my own special talent, which I think everybody has. I never knew I had it. And it just unlocked it, just kind of opened up this sort of Pandora's box, really. And from there, 5 years later, I have 4 published books, and I'm writing a 5th one as we speak.
That's absolutely fascinating. And that's something you don't really hear a lot of writers starting out. That is like a really, materialized goal. And I think it says a lot about, drive and getting to get something done rather than having the hypothetical in your head.
Well, the ironic thing is, I didn't, like when I was in school and stuff, I hated writing. But
Wow.
I, yeah, I look back on it now, and of course, in school, the teachers say, all right, write about this subject, write about that subject. Well, I really don't want to write a subject. The only time I actually really enjoyed writing was, I remember one assignment where we had to write a short story, just pick whatever, and I wrote it and I got an A. And then there was another time where we read The Outsiders.
Yeah.
I don't know if you've ever read that book, The Outsiders. And they said for an assignment, we were all to write another chapter in the book, like a chapter that happens after the events of the book. And I wrote it. I actually still remember what I wrote, and I got an A on that too. So I guess whenever it was something that was on my terms, I did well in. But I didn't pay enough attention to that when I was younger, and so I didn't discover it until I was 25.
Some people it takes a while to find out what your passion is, and it sounds like it was there just knocking at the door for the right moment to
Yes,
happen. Yeah. And
yes.
yeah. Well, speaking of writing, so you mentioned you always enjoyed true crime and crime fiction genres. What drew you into these particular genres?
I guess crime fiction happened first. Just the whole story of the good guy versus the bad guy type thing
Yeah.
with but set in a more realistic setting, aside from like, in contrast to fantasy and sci-fi, which are fantastic genres, but I like
Yeah.
more the realism, and I kind of like exploring the kind of just like the darker realm of society. For me, it's a great like character study, and of course, so with crime fiction, drew me into reading more about true crime as well, which I've always found again something very fascinating to me. And I learned a lot about like the mafia and gangsters and bank robbers and serial killers and white collar crimes and pretty much a little bit of everything.
And that's really
And I just
fascinating.
can't get enough of it.
Yeah, I'm a bit the same way myself. I've always been drawn to, certain times, how people lived, why they made choices, how society was. And that does tie in with a lot of things like crime, gangster mafia, that realm where things are kind of gray and muddled, so to speak.
Right,
Um,
right.
yeah. So when you set out to write your works, there's certainly some research involved in the creation of these works. How do you go about the research process in your work?
Um, I mean, Google has been my best friend lately,
I agree.
and I do enjoy learning new things, of course. Um, it kind of depends on the story itself. Like, for example, in my Ice series, it takes place from like the mid '80s, and so far it's in the early '90s. So, so that requires a lot of research into that time period. I mean, I was born in '93, so I kind of missed that era by a few years. So I had to revisit it and see like, okay, what happened right before I was born, and what can I kind of remember when I was 3, and how relevant is that to the
To
story?
Yeah.
And then there was like the Ballad of Johnny Carlo, which takes place in areas I've never been to, like New York City, New Orleans, and I really had to kind of study the cities, and especially with New Orleans, I had to study the culture of it. And one thing I've learned is that after learning more about New Orleans, I really want to go to New Orleans.
That's really fascinating. And that's like I know what you mean. Like I've always wanted to go to like Chicago and just
Mhm.
experience, the big windy city. And also it seems like we're almost the same age. I was born in 92, so we're like the same age. So we probably remember a lot of the same stuff. We're technically 90s babies by law. um so I did want to ask,
Barely.
yeah, very I did want to ask, so speaking of research and everything, when you're writing fiction, how much fact do you factor in? Do you look at it and decide how much fact, or does it kind of come organically as you're building the plot and the characters?
It kind of comes organically. I like to stretch it a little bit. Stretch kind of like the laws of what's realistically possible, not to the point where people are floating in air and whatnot,
Right.
but like in the Ballad of Johnny Carlo, I one of my characters is a very large character, very muscular, and there's a scene where he's a very polite individual, but there's times where he has to demonstrate like his strength.
Right.
Like there's a scene where he has to convince Johnny Carlo to come with him, and there's a door between them. And he
Oh.
says, "Okay, Mr. Carlo, obviously you're not listening to me. I need to demonstrate something to you. Please take a step back." And he does, and he puts his fist right through the door. And
Oh my
then
goodness, that's a very very effective demonstration, very good persuasion.
Well, and there's a scene later where the same character actually busts through a wall. It's not, a brick wall.
Well, not a brick wall, but like a thin
It's a
plaster
cheaper
wall.
wall, but it's very tough to do. At the same time, I also
I love
um
that. Bit of
so I
humor
like to
there.
throw that in a little bit just to kind of, I don't know,
Break
I
the
just like
monotony.
how right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just like how it works because it kind of has that entertainment value to it. So like when maybe the reader's expecting something and I like to throw it in as a surprise, like, hey, I can do this as well.
I love that. I think that's important to when you're writing something to, add different elements because that does mirror more of real life. Sometimes things that we don't realize are funny, but the ironic things happen, like a guy bursting through a wall, for what maybe to accomplish something or break through. But I love that, and not a lot of people do that, in these particular genres. It's kind of like not one note, but like there's you run the risk of kind of having a monotonous tone, and that can kind of convey sometimes when you don't break it with more of the realisms and ironies and the humorous stuff of life that happens.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. Well, I was going to ask too, so I guess this does tie in to the previous question. How do you know what is the right amount of fact to put into work? Do you know that right away, or do you think it's more of a it comes organically as you're developing the plot or the character?
Again, I would say that is organic. For me, it just depends on how well it fits into the story. Like when I write a setting, for example, I want to be a little more realistic. So with, like I said, with the Ballad of Johnny Carlo is the best example. I really wanted to know a lot about culture. What are the foods that they're eating? How do they speak? What type of people live here? What type of areas are they in? To kind of give somebody a more accurate view of the setting itself. So they can, so that if they look into it, they'll say, okay, this guy obviously has, I don't want them to think this guy has no idea what he's talking about. Like
Right.
it's a New Orleans is hot, it's snowing down here, or whatever.
Right.
And or with my ice series, the way I started off was making it very kind of like Goodfellas, where there's a lot of explanation into what's going on. Um, with just a little bit of my own spin to it, if that makes sense.
I get what you mean. It's a bit like it's like your own. It's like you're doing this through first person perspective, but you also want to imbibe your own personal style into it. So it's more of a human or organic feeling to the book or to the writing.
Right, right. Like
Yeah.
my biggest focus is breaking the mold in certain, parts of my stories. Instead of the character doing something you'd expect them to do, they kind of go in the opposite direction, or how some characters can develop over time, or just their own. I mean, they're like what they go through and how they overcome it is not what you expect. Like, I wrote a story about in my latest book, Life's Dark Corners. One of my main characters is a widow. She's in her 70s, her husband passed, and she's targeted by these two hitmen. And they break into her house, and what they don't know is that she had learned how to use her husband's Vietnam War era service weapons because he was a soldier, and he taught her how to use them before he passed. So the one of the hitmen breaks in and she shoots him. So instead of
Wow.
being like the victim, as a lot of elderly women tend to be portrayed in stories, in this one she came out on top.
Right, right. She definitely broke that stereotype of the, defenseless old lady. She came out with, iron blazing.
Right.
Yeah. Well, so there's another question. What do you think of, this genre of crime fiction? Do you have any particular favorite authors that have influenced your writing or style, or has it been mostly just kind of a just sort of a pastiche of all general reading?
I would have to pick probably three different authors. One would be TJ English, who is more of he's a true crime writer. He's written about like the Cuban mafia, the Irish mafia, just crime syndicates and whatnot throughout the ages. But with fiction, I enjoy Mario Puzo and James Patterson. I like Mario Puzo because I'm a big fan of The Godfather, so I watched The Godfather, fell
Yeah.
in love with the movies. Then I read the book, and it was fantastic. And I read a lot of his other books, and his one book, The Last Don, is still my favorite book of all time. I just like how how the way he explains things. He just it's so romantic,
It
and I kind of
is.
yeah, I kind of
Yeah.
it has that romantic vibe about gangsters, and so I kind of have that with yeah, I incorporated that a little bit with the Ballad of Johnny Carlo with the mafia don that's in the story, Dominic Argento. He's very like kind of Don Corleone esque, not exactly, of course, to
Yeah.
but very similar in just mannerisms, how he talks. He's just has kind of like a poetic talk about him, very dramatic. But I also like James Patterson because what what I love about James Patterson is that I mean he just writes a great story. And that's the kind of writer that I am. I think there's different types of writers that when we're writing, we're trying to convey certain messages. Some of us like Fyodor Dostoevsky, who wrote The Brothers Karamazov and Crime and Punishment, is very poetic. Everybody represents something. One brother represents the emotional instability of society. Another one represents morals or whatever. Then you have other authors that are political, or they have a message, or there's like a life lesson in the book, or it's a memoir. Me personally, I just like to write a good story. I like to entertain. That's where my area is. At first, I thought I was going to be, kind of teaching kids to steer from crime, but I realized like that's not really my story. That's not really my lesson to tell. I mean, if somebody reads my books and says, "Okay, you know what? This has steered me away from a life of crime." I mean, I guess there's people who had watched Scarface and said, "Oh, I'm definitely never going to sell drugs." I
Right.
mean,
Yeah. Don't end up like
that's
that.
going to happen. So I don't mind doing that, but mainly, I think like James Patterson, it's mostly to entertain. I like to entertain. I just want people to read my book, go whoa, and put it down, and say that was amazing.
And that's such a wonderful motivation to have. I think today people kind of get lost in the sauce of having so many motivations, I mean, which are fine, which are great, but then I think we've lost just the sake of reading or writing something just to enjoy a good story, and that in itself boils it down to the essence of what writing is all about, creating, spinning a good yarn, so to speak.
I'm reading an Agatha Christie book right now called Murder on the Orient Express, and it's such a refreshing read because like nowadays murder mysteries, like it's always like this detective who is about to lose his job, hates his job, he's nihilist, doesn't really see much hope. He may have a drinking problem, doesn't get along with his parents. There's a bad divorce in his
Mm,
background, and he's like, he might be on the take a little bit, and he's just dealing with scumbags, and then there's a murder. He's got to figure out who the murderer is, and the guy that died is not really a good person. Nobody else they know is a good person, and just has that noir feeling, which is great. I
yeah.
like that,
Yeah.
but then you read this Agatha Christie book, which I know that the detective in that story is part of a series, but to me, in comparison, he just seems like a Joe Friday character who is just this, this cop or investigator who's just a good guy trying to investigate this murder and find the dastardly villain on the
Yes.
train. And it's just, I just enjoy the simplicity of a good story sometimes.
And that's true. Sometimes it's nice just to have a breath of positivity and not get lost in the muddle of gray moralities. Because if you can't find at least one character to be sympathetic towards, it kind of drags you down, and it kind of makes you not really root for the character, but maybe root for the outcome, whatever it may be. You know.
Right.
Yeah. Well, I did want to ask. So there's another question. And I wasn't sure if you're okay, with me asking this. In 2015, you joined the Department of Corrections as an officer. Has this influenced your approach in writing your work, or is that sort of a separate aspect?
I would say it's separate. And just, because it is mentioned, whatever opinions that I may have are my own. I am not a spokesman for the Department of Corrections. In no way, do my opinions necessarily are parallel to theirs. So whatever opinions I have are my own. I'm not a spokesman. That's just something I have to say whenever it's brought up. So for me, yeah, so when I first wrote my first book, it was going to be a prison thriller. Just because I'm familiar with the environment. And I wrote the entire book and I never got to that point where he's in prison. But in the sequel, Icebox, it is a prison thriller. The 99% of the story takes place behind the walls of a correctional facility. Not in the same state that I live in. It's in a fictional prison in a fictional area of a state, 30 some years
Horrible.
ago. So it's no
Yeah.
relation to where I'm at. Um, but it did make the writing easier, and that was the one story where I really wanted to convey a message, which was in the book. Of course, I have, even though my main character in the series is actually a convicted felon, um, he has interaction with staff, and the staff are relatively neutral characters, which I would say, in my opinion, represents kind of the majority of staff. Is that they're relatively neutral people that are going there to do a job. That's how they pay their bills, and they respect the job and they do what's required of them. And as opposed to a lot of shows and stuff out there where, especially like Shawshank Redemption or Orange is the New Black, where officers are depicted as corrupt or abusive
Malicious.
or malicious or neglectful or inept at their job, which I think is a very unfair representation of
Very
correctional
true.
officers as a whole. The most prominent character that's a staff member in my book Icebox is his name is Soretti. Not just I picked that name off the top of my head. So if there's an officer Soretti out there listening to this, it's not you. And he tells Ice when Ice goes to his unit, he says, "Listen, um, do what you do. Just whatever you're going to be doing. I'm here to do my time. You do your time. Keep it quiet. If I have to do my job, I will do my job. Understand that. But we don't have to have a problem right off the bat." So that is where I really wanted to convey a message. In the story, like I said, they're relatively neutral characters. They're present. But a lot of times the only time that they're involved is when like a fight breaks out and all of a sudden they swarm the area, or when they have to go onto the yard and cuff up one of the characters and take them to the hole for an investigation, just things like that. That's when they're present.
That's something very nuanced, and that's something that's often neglected, I think in a lot of, crime fiction. I mean, not only, how do I say, the importance, but the fact that, this particular party's not treated with respect or depicted accurately. And I think that needs to be shown. I think that needs to be more represented. And I think that's really great that you've taken that approach and you've wanted to convey that through Icebox. And hopefully, there will be readers who read that and, appreciate that accuracy, and maybe people who are also in the field read that and also appreciate that representation of accuracy.
Exactly.
Yeah. So another question, uh how, when you approach a story, do you approach it with pretty much the plot all planned out, or would you say it's more of a process where you begin the first chapter and it just all falls into place? Or what would you say, how would you say a novel is born, so to speak?
I am a total pantser. I have no idea what's going to happen in my story. I start off with the beginning that I know, and I kind of have an idea for the ending, but that is subject to change. Right now, I'm writing the third book in my Ice series called Ice Rain, and it's gone in such a different direction than I had originally thought it was going to. There's been a couple characters where I was going to just write them off as kind of, like one character I kind of was going to say he was kind of just a sad stack type of character, really tragic, and he's really come into his own in the story, which actually surprised me. So I like to tell readers that I'm going to be the first one surprised by the story because I'm writing it. I just have no idea where it's going to take me. Like I wrote Ballad of Johnny Carlo. That took me 15 months to write it, and I finished it, and it's 500 pages long. I didn't plan for it to be that long,
That's
but
interesting.
15 months later, I
Yeah.
you know I kind of have a feeling of when I'm nearing the end of a story. I think, okay, I can just kind of feel like the rest kind of leaving me. I just kind of go where it takes me, so to speak. I have no outlines. I may have a very basic list of characters that I want to incorporate, but aside from that, I'm just kind of riding this roller coaster. I just created a character in Ice Rain off the top of my head, like just he popped up in a scene somewhere and just kind of made his grand entrance in my head. Like, hey, you know what? That's an interesting guy that I could create, like right there. And I just off the top of my head, no plan to it, just it happened.
That's absolutely, fantastic when something like that kind of just springs up, just pops out and person makes their entrance, and then you realize I'm going to keep you around for the third and fifth act. Um, I did want to ask, out of all the works you've created and of all the time that you've been writing, do you have any favorite characters? And, with those favorite characters, what would be some of their favorite arcs they've gone through?
Um, I have a few. Some of them I some of them just because of spoilers, I can't really list all of them.
True.
But I do enjoy the or in Ballad Johnny Carlo, one of my favorite characters is this guy named Vincent, who is the best friend of Johnny. Now, Johnny's a hitman in Ballad Johnny Carlo, and Vincent's his best friend. He's also a hitman. Johnny kind of has that. He's got a code of honor. He's got kind of the moral hitman arc to him. But Vincent, on the other hand, is a darker version of him. And the only reason he refrains from taking innocent life is because he respects Johnny. But then there's a rift in their friendship where they become enemies, and Vincent, now he's pretty much off any moral obligatory leash. I enjoyed writing him because he's one of the closest characters to um chaotic evil, if that makes sense. Like in the morality kind of Dungeons and Dragons type of
Right.
morals, he's the darkest character. He enjoys what he does. He enjoys taking life. So it was kind of interesting going into that dark depth of a mindset such as his. I also enjoyed see, I mean, I like my Ice character in the Ice series, you know, because I'm basically growing up with this guy. I'm writing his story from the time that he's a little kid to, you know, now he's in his early 20s and he's, you know, he has a lot on his plate. And it's just kind of fun, you know, in a way he's like a friend. And I'm like in the car ride with him, driving, riding shotgun while he's driving me. So, you know, I'm just so used to having him around now. So it's almost like he's in the room with me. So I do enjoy that character. I enjoyed goodness, who else? The Brutus character who he I mentioned him. He's another Ballad Johnny Carlo character. He's the man I mentioned earlier who puts his fist through the door. He's
Yes.
a bodyguard. He's a bodyguard for this New Orleans crime lord. Very big, strong guy, but he's actually also a genius. So
Oh,
you know he's not
wow.
just dumb muscle,
I like
and he
that.
really shows himself. Yeah, he's definitely a break the mold type of character. But yeah, I enjoyed writing him. I also wrote an origin story for him in Life's Dark Corners, my latest book, which is a collection of short stories. I gave Brutus an origin story that takes place 20 years before the events of the Ballad of Johnny Carlo. Kind of how him and the New Orleans crime boss Frank Abraham meet. So those are some of my favorite. I also enjoy the character of Skinny, who is in the Ice series. He's one of Ice's childhood friends. Yeah, I enjoy him as a character as well.
Well,
But I
that's
can't
a
talk too much about him because
spoilers.
you know yeah, spoilers.
Spoilers. Well, that's awesome. And also, I'm definitely loving Brutus because I have a soft spot for like the big smart guys. um, so I did want to ask you too. So, kind of to, I guess one of the next to final questions, how do you come up with the titles? Does it take you a long while? Is it kind of an agonizing process, or is it the first thing that pops into your head when you're writing?
It depends on the story.
Mm.
Ballad of Johnny Carlo, I came up with pretty quick. You know, I just it had just a good ring to it. It
Ring
just
to I
popped in
like
my
it.
head, but
Like
yeah,
it.
but Ice Rising was the most hardest one. Of course, it's my first book. I had these different poetic titles for it, and eventually, just my character Ice. I don't know. It again, it just popped up in my head. Again, I'm not a planner at all, so it's you know, it's just as soon as it comes to me and it has a good ring to it, I go with it.
That's awesome. So basically you thrive on spontaneity. Spontaneity.
Yes,
Yeah, so
yes.
I did want to ask, so final question. I know you had mentioned it, but maybe you wanted to further elaborate on it. What's the goal in your writing work, and what do you wish to impart in your readers? And I guess just as part of this question also as well, what advice do you have for people who want to get started writing, especially in this genre? What would you say to them?
Okay. Well, so yeah, to the first question, I would say I just want to keep writing. You know, it's something that I've really found in myself. I'm never gonna retire from it. I enjoy it. I just love creating stories, and it's probably something that's gonna stick with me till you know eventually my time comes. You know, again, like I just want my readers to really enjoy the story, sit down, enjoy it, really kind of have this, you know, edge of the seat type thriller stories to provide to them. And then for aspiring writers, I'd say, you know, if you really want to get into it, sometimes all you have to do is just start writing chapter one and just let it flow from there. At least have something there that you can build from. And then figure out what type of writer you are. Maybe you're a plotter. You have to sit down and outline everything to the detail about what's going to happen. Or maybe you're just like me and you just need to, you know, turn the key in the ignition and, you know, turn it over and
Turn it over.
start driving.
Yeah. Yeah, so I mean, well, thank you so much. This was a very, very fascinating interview. We definitely learned a lot, gained a new perspective, not only on this genre, but having a more spontaneous approach, I think, which is vital for a lot of writers. And also definitely we will be featuring in the official introduction, and of course link in bios to all of your different works, including your newest work. I think we have at least a couple minutes if you wanted to talk a bit about your newest work that you're releasing.
So the last book that I released was Life's Dark Corners, and that was my collection of short stories. And so it's five different stories. So kind of a brief synopsis on each of them. First story is about a man who's a long time criminal on the street who kind of finally finds his own little niche in the underworld, but it has disastrous consequences for him. The second story is about the soldier's widow. That's actually the title, where this elderly woman finds herself targeted by two hitmen who, unlike the character in the last book, she has no enemies. She's a total law-abiding citizen. Why are they after her? Third story is that Bruce? No, that's about a photographer, an amnesiac photographer who finds himself in the middle of this serial homicide investigation, and the answers may hit a little closer to home than he expects. Fourth story is the origin story of Brutus, who is a medical student who comes back to New Orleans after the death of his mother, and he finds himself, he's reconnecting with his father, but there's a gang war going on in the street that may alter his destiny in a way that he did not foresee. Fifth story is about a young teenage boy who loves violent video games, violent movies, and maybe he's kind of ready to take it to another level and move his fantasies into the reality, it's the real world. That is, yes. So that is Life's Dark Corners in a very basic nutshell. Five different people, five epic tales of crime.
Well, this is very fascinating, and we are definitely sharing all of your works with links, not only in our introduction but in our description. And I think our audience will definitely enjoy discovering your works. And James, thank you again for joining us. Thank you for sharing your insight. Thanks for reaching out to us. It was an absolute delight and just so much to learn. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me on.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, we certainly hope to see you again, and thank you again. Okay, goodbye.
Bye.